Russian forces continue their offensive, closing in on Avdiivka. The U.S. is a little bit closer to passing a Ukraine aid bill, although it might be dead on arrival when it gets to the House. Vladimir Putin sat down for an interview with Tucker Carlson that was something else. I'll give you my key takeaways from that conversation. And President Zelensky, after replacing his top general, laid out a series of proposed reforms for the Ukrainian armed forces. We'll talk through all of that. It's a lot, so I'm glad you're here. I'm recording this at 9:30 a.m. Central on Tuesday, February 13th, 2024. Starting with updates from the battlefield, the major focus right now is in and around the Ukrainian city of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. I'm going to pull up a couple maps here. I'm using Deep State Map, a bunch of different resources out there. You've got Live UA Map, Rybar, Deep State, and a handful of others. What we're looking at here is that Avdiivka continues to be somewhat surrounded. This isn't necessarily new. Avdiivka has kind of remained a pocket in the lines for a long time now. I'll pull up another map here showing what Avdiivka looked like a full year ago. So there has been Russian progress, certainly, and they continue to kind of close this pocket of Ukrainian forces in the city itself. In the grand scheme of the war, it's not a lot of progress, but when you're just looking at Avdiivka, it's getting more and more dire there for Ukrainian forces by the day. News just came out earlier today. I saw that Ukraine is starting to rotate troops in and out of Avdiivka for the first time in 2 years. So a lot of the soldiers that have been manning that front have been there since the very start of the war. And it's been really at the front line of contact since this war kicked off, since before this war kicked off, dating back closer to 2014. What that has meant is that compared with other portions of the lines, this area has been relatively well defended. Similar to, Marinka a little further south, it took Russia a long, long time and a lot of men and equipment to eventually seize. You're seeing a similar situation play out here in Avdiivka, where some Russian officials have referred to this city as a fortress full of concrete bunkers. There have been, we're getting into losses here, very hard to gauge across this war for both sides. It's certainly happening. Some Russian mill bloggers have talked about pretty significant Russian losses in taking this town or in continuing to try to take this town. But there's also a high likelihood that Ukraine is suffering significant casualties here as well. One of the major Russian tactics that we've seen played out in Avdiivka, elsewhere along the front as well, but it's kind of been a focus in Avdiivka, is the use of very large guided bombs. So we're seeing upwards of, 1,000-kilometer bombs at times being dropped directly into the center of Avdiivka. It's a lot for those soldiers at the front manning those positions to be under that constant bombardment day in and day out. Now, in terms of what this means, big picture for the war, very similar to when we look at other areas in eastern and southern Ukraine that have traded hands in the past year to 18 months. Similar in a sense to Bakhmut, similar to Marinka, where the changing of hands for that territory is not in of itself going to significantly alter the outcome of the war, but it's this inch-by-inch approach that Russia continues to move forward. It continues to take more Ukrainian territory. It's not necessarily the territory that matters, it's the lives and equipment lost in defending or taking that territory. This war long ago kind of transitioned into more of an attritional type conflict, so that's the major question here. What is the loss ratio in taking this territory? And a major aspect for Russia here is if they can move Ukraine out of this fortified city center, it potentially pushes Ukrainian forces into less well-prepared defenses, more likely to be killed as Russian forces continue their advance. But again, Avdiivka kind of center focus right now in Ukraine. Haven't seen a lot of territorial changes on the battlefield in the last few months. Marinka fell into Russian hands. It looks like before too long, Avdiivka as well is at the same risk. The major challenge here being that getting supplies in and out of Avdiivka right now, including troops, ammunition, medical supplies, moving casualties out, that lone route is increasingly coming under Russian direct fire control. That essentially shuts down that route and over time will isolate the defenders set there in Avdiivka. Now, there were some rumors circulating that Ukraine might be reinforcing Avdiivka. Additional troops might be coming in to try to alleviate some of that pressure. Very well could be the case. Again, we'll just have to wait and see how this situation develops. Now, turning to the United States, where an aid package was proposed by President Biden a few months ago, went nowhere. Did not get any traction in the House or the Senate. It looks like there might be progress now, somewhat, but there's still some significant roadblocks ahead. So early this morning, the Senate passed a $94.34 billion aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. This legislation includes $61 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel in its war against Hamas, $4.83 billion to support our partners in the Indo-Pacific, including Taiwan, and $9.15 billion in humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, the West Bank, Ukraine, and other conflict areas all around the world. So progress in a sense that this bill that has been talked about for a long time made some sort of movement. It moved forward. The Senate voted yes. The challenge here, according to Republican Senator Rick Scott, he said the bill before us today will never pass in the House. It will never become law. And then turning to kind of the reaction in the House, the speaker there, Mike Johnson, said, quote, "The Senate's foreign aid bill is silent on the most pressing issue facing our country. In the absence of having received any single border policy change from the Senate, the House will have to continue its work, its own will, to impose these important matters." So, a couple takeaways there. It is moving through the Senate. It moved through the Senate. It appears pretty unlikely at this point that this bill in its current format will pass through the House, providing additional resources and aid to Ukraine and our other allies. We're starting to get down into some weeds of how U.S. politics work and how this could be bypassed or different ways this could be split out and passed in some way, shape, or form. That's over my head, so we're just going to have to wait and see how this comes together in the coming days. But for now, we'll wait to see what the House officially says when it hits the floor for a vote. But I would not be very optimistic that this is going to move any further than it has in its current form. Before diving into the Carlson Putin interview, I wanted to show you this study that I came across from Duke University that really hit home for me, and I think applies to a lot of you watching this video. So in this study, Duke was able to purchase location, health, and financial data from active and former military members for as little as 12 cents per record, which is wild, right? And part of this study, they found out one of the brokers that they worked with to buy this data from, to buy your data from and my data from, they said that if they pay with wire instead of credit card, they could skip the customer verification process. As in, use this payment process instead of the other. You don't even have to tell us why you're buying this person's data, which is wild. That means anybody can buy this for any reason, right? Which should be terrifying. That applies to everybody. This example is about veterans and military members. It applies to everybody. So here's a look at some of the data they were able to purchase for this study, which again means anybody can purchase this because they didn't have to say what they're using it for. That set in the middle there is where they got it down to 12 cents per record, but it's the other two I think that should really give you pause. You know, for less than a quarter per record, really anybody can purchase very sensitive and personal information on you and your family. The tool that I use to help protect me and my family here is called DeleteMe. So they monitor data broker sites, and whenever our personal data shows up, they get it removed. Part of the challenge here with all of this is getting your personal data removed from these sites is not a one-time thing. So the DeleteMe subscription is just constantly scanning the web, and then whenever something new pops up, they get it removed. So here's a look at my most recent report from DeleteMe. They reviewed over 4,500 listings and removed 44 of them across 40 different data brokers that included 195 pieces of my personally identifiable information. My data, my personal information is just out there being sold. I don't like that. That doesn't feel good. It feels good to push back and to start getting some of these removed. So if you're interested in taking action here and trying to protect you and your family from some of these data brokers, check out the link in the description to DeleteMe and be sure to use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. Then last week, in what turned out to be pretty major news, kind of across all outlets, was that Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, went to Russia and interviewed Russian President Vladimir Putin in like a 2.5 hour long interview. My plan, for what it's worth, was I was going to watch that thing and then do a whole video kind of rolling up what was discussed, what they said, what they didn't say. But holy cow, I am interested in this kind of stuff, and it was boring. It was rough. If you made it all the way through that thing, start to finish, good on you. I'm impressed. It took a long time, took multiple iterations. It was not the most interesting conversation I've ever listened in on. So a couple big takeaways that I gathered from this. First and foremost, whether you think this was a good thing, a bad thing in any direction, I think it's worth paying attention to what was discussed and looking at it because it got a lot of attention. You know, the last time I saw on Twitter, now the views there are skewed for sure, but it was north of like 170 million views on Twitter. So, you know, be skeptical of those views for sure. Twitter's weird with that. But even on YouTube, it's in the millions of views. So a lot of people, and then major news outlets around the world were covering this interview. So it's a focus. So it's worth understanding a little bit what they got into, which was essentially Russian history. That's kind of my big takeaway here, is for all of the different nuanced talking points as to why Russia is doing what they're doing and have done what they've done in Ukraine. Conversations about NATO, the U.S. attacking them, any number of other things, or wanting to attack them, any of these other things, a warm water port, control of Crimea, all of these different things, it all comes back, from what it looks like here, to Russian history for Putin. That is the thing. Carlson largely gave Putin a pretty wide runway. He did kind of he tried to direct him at times to get him to talk about certain things, and he largely didn't ever take the bait. Putin just kind of went in whatever direction he wanted, and that direction, time and time again, was Russian history, dating back hundreds of years. So when you're looking at all of the different reasons why Putin and Russia are pursuing this war in Ukraine, it comes down to history. It comes down to largely that in Putin's version of history, his reading of history, Ukraine is not a legitimate state. It is a part of the Russian Empire, and it will return to that status. Now, there's already been a fair amount of content out there kind of fact-checking this interview, and you can kind of find it from any direction. It's one of those. I mean, there's 2.5 hours worth of content, so you can find just about any assessment of this interview that you want at this point. And I do think there's some value in that, people picking things apart to say, hey, this is a little misleading, or they left out this aspect during this part of the conversation. By and large, I kind of like the direction that Carlson took this, where he just kind of backed off. He led Putin in a direction and then just stepped back and let him talk. I think when you're talking to somebody like this, the leader of a nation at war in a major moment in history, the most important thing you can do is just let them talk and see what they decide is the important thing to discuss. Whether you think what Putin decides to talk about is good, bad, right, wrong, or any of that stuff, there is some insight gained by understanding what the nation of a leader of war chooses to talk about when he has that opportunity. So again, if you've got 2.5 hours, maybe a long drive, and you're bored, it's worth a listen. There's a lot there. And then last week, there were some pretty significant changes in Ukraine that I've talked about in a previous video. President Zelensky changed out the head of the Ukrainian military, and alongside that, he gave a speech talking about some proposed changes to the overall Ukrainian military. We'll run through those here. In that speech, he said, quote, "We have to be honest. The feeling of stagnation, specifically in the southern directions, and the difficulties in this battle in the Donetsk region have affected the public mood. Ukrainians are speaking of victory less often. However, the Ukrainian spirit has not lost faith in victory." He said, "I expect the following changes in the armed forces of Ukraine in the near future. First, a realistic, detailed plan for the armed forces of Ukraine for 2024 must be presented. It must take into account the real situation on the battlefield now and the prospects." Good for any country at war or at peace, right? To have a real plan, recognizing the real life situation at the front, not what we want it to be, not what we think it could be, but this is the actual situation. Here's how we are going to proceed. It sounds like that's what he's pushing for there. He says each combat brigade on the first line must receive effective Western weapons, and there must be a fair distribution of such weapons in favor of the first line. I've seen this interpreted a couple ways. One, that it's projected towards the West, saying we need more, give us more weapons. The other interpretation here is saying we have to take the weapons that we have and distribute those fairly and appropriately. And appropriately means more of those to the front where they're going to be used in combat with Russian troops. So either way, looking at the distribution of some of this new military equipment, he says the logistics problems must be resolved. Avdiivka must not wait for the generals to find out which warehouses the drones are stuck in. Sounds about right. Every military at war or at peace really is having logistical issues. It's hard to tell how significant of an issue this is right now for Ukraine, but it should always be a focus, always an area that could be improved upon. He says every general must know the front. If a general does not know the front, he does not serve Ukraine. He says the excessive and unjustified number of personnel in the headquarters must be adjusted. Those two kind of go together. So talking about any military force can at times become very top-heavy, and you get a very, very large headquarters element. What Zelensky's pushing for here is we need to reduce that headquarters element, push more people out towards the front. We need more of these leaders out towards the front. They need to understand what is happening out there, whether that means rotating through leadership positions with frontline units or just battlefield circulation of sorts, trying to remove people from some of these more back office jobs and push them out into more combat command type situations. He says an effective rotation system must be established in the Army. The experience of certain combat brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine and units of the state border guard where such a system is in place can be used as a basis. Rotations are a must, a challenge in any large-scale war like this. There were some crazy examples going back to World War I, especially with some of the French military, where they were just at the front for a long period of time. You have a hard time now, or after the war, I should say, finding first-person accounts from French soldiers that fought in those early battles in 1914 because they stayed at the front. They didn't fight in a few battles and then rotate back. They stayed out there, and there just weren't that many French soldiers that survived a couple of years at the front. It's a lesson that we as a collective military around the world have learned the hard way, that even in a situation like Ukraine is facing right now where they are hurting for manpower, and that's a major challenge they have in this war, they have to be able to rotate troops off the front line. It has to happen over time. He says there's an obvious need to improve the quality of training for the warriors. Only trained soldiers can be at the front line. This sounds a little bit like some criticism that came about during the early days of the Ukrainian offensive this summer, when some of the units that were pushed forward into the assault were relatively newly trained. They were new on this Western equipment, relatively recently stood up as a whole, and they were asked to do a lot to breach an assault through some of the most well-defended territory that Europe has seen since World War II. It was a big ask. And in the last piece here, he said a new type of forces is being created in the structure of the armed forces, the unmanned systems forces, the first commander to be appointed. So a drone unit, if you will, rather than drones being a part of this war, kind of falling in all across the battlefield, right? You got intelligence units using drones, both immediate reconnaissance and long-range reconnaissance. You've got people conducting strikes inside of Russia with these drones and dropping grenades right along the front on forwardmost Russian positions. What they're doing is they're consolidating, to a degree, a command there. The unmanned systems forces, that'll be interesting, and that's something that the United States and others should pay attention to. Is this drone warfare such a significant aspect of the battlefield that it should be plucked out like this, with some sort of structure provided and command system in place, maybe a formalized training system, something like that. But it's unique in a sense. I don't believe Russia has anything like this, a unified drone command. So it kind of looks like the first, at least the first to be tested out in a major modern war like this. So something worth keeping an eye on. But that's all I've got for now. Of course, if interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out my Substack, which is linked in the description below. We've just brought a few experts, researchers, analysts, writers on board that are providing some deep dives into some of these subjects adjacent to what I'm talking about in these videos, with the idea of providing a little more background around the topics that I'm covering. They're free. If interested, link is in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.